Welcome to the OverAnalyzers. I'm Dan. He's Mike. 6 months ago, we got a comment by Musanthrope. I'm thirsty to hear your take on the Dunning Kruger effect. From my experience, it's a very important principle of how people learn things. So that's what we'll be talking about today.
Well, I hope you weren't too thirsty because it took us 6 months to get around to it. Uh, I didn't think this would be that interesting, to be honest, but it is. We both started really looking into the Dunning Kruger effect and what that actually means, and we read the original paper, and it's great. It's like one of the best papers I've read in a while. I found it really fascinating.
First, I read the Wikipedia page on it, and I wasn't that into it. And I thought I understood it until I read the paper. And then I read the paper and I was like, oh my God, this is actually really, really interesting. So if you're looking into it, don't just read the Wikipedia page because it doesn't do a good job.
Well, I came across all these articles. I don't know why I didn't just read the original paper first, probably because it's long and kind of dense. But I came across all these articles saying the Dunning-Kruger effect isn't real and it's, people get it wrong and whatever. And the internet sucks. Let me just say that. The original paper is great. Really great. It's really easy to read. Like, everybody should read it. It's super fascinating. And I think probably a big part of the problem is that there is no Dunning-Kruger effect. Like, that is not part of the paper. The paper is by two authors, Dunning and Kruger. Their names were Justin Kruger and David Dunning from Cornell University. And the paper is just an observation of how people assess themselves, like their own performance. There's no single, like, oh, the Dunning-Kruger effect, it got you this time. Like, that really wasn't it. It's much more subtle. It's much more interesting. And that's, what made this much more fascinating than I was expecting it to be.
Yeah, and I'm realizing that it does not just apply to incompetent people or dumb people or idiots. It's like this is an effect that weaves its way into everything that a person believes is right, or can weave its way into everything. So it's very relatable, whether you're an idiot or not.
Right. Well, and actually, I think the problem is that the popular take on it, or what we usually think of when we think of the Dunning-Kruger effect, is we think of it in terms of someone else. We should say this because I think maybe not everyone has heard of this, but usually the way this is used, like colloquially, is the Dunning-Kruger effect is a way of saying that someone is stupid and they're really confident in their stupidity. That's how it's used. It's almost a meme. Like, if someone says something really wrong and they say it with utmost confidence, people are like, ha, Dunning-Kruger effect. That's kind of the popular take on it. But that's really not what it is. And in fact, I would say, and we'll try to unravel this as we go, but I would say that is exactly the opposite of what you should have taken away from it. And the author, Dunning, I think it was, is like well after the fact, once this paper kind of blew up and became very popular, he was quoted as saying, the paper was never supposed to be about them. It's supposed to be about us. And it is something that you are supposed to understand on your own terms of this is a problem that you face. And if you're applying it to everyone else and thinking, ha, dumb people, you utterly missed the point.
It's also really easy to assume that it's just about dumb people. In sort of the tone they had while writing, I think. But maybe we'll get to that later. First, for someone who's never heard of Dunning-Kruger effect, what is it? If it's not stupid people are so stupid they don't know they're stupid, what is it?
Okay, here's what they actually did. They did a series of experiments or tests, basically, where they took a group of people, they gave them a test. They actually tested them on their sense of humor, which I thought was an odd choice, but they gave them a written test to evaluate how funny they were. So they tested them on humor. They tested them on logic, and they tested them on grammar. So they did this in a couple different areas. And they basically, they took all these people, they gave them a test, and before they knew how well they had done, they said, how well do you think you did? How well do you think you did compared to all the other people in the group? You know, do you think you're one of the top performers? Do you think you're one of the bottom, or what? And so people had to basically guess or evaluate how well they did, and then they ultimately compared that to how well they actually did. And what they found was that people at the very top had a reasonable bead on how well they did. You know, they were, if you performed in the top, like, 25%, you would generally guess that you're in the top 25%. So people who perform well guess that they perform pretty well. They actually they underestimate themselves a little bit, but we'll talk about that later, because that's actually like
Super
basically what
interesting.
yeah, it's interesting, and it's kind of what has to happen mathematically. But the people who perform really poorly, they pretty grossly overestimated how well they would perform. The people at the bottom, they didn't say that they were in the top 10% necessarily, but they said like, oh, I'm top, I'm like number 60 or number 70. Like, they guessed that they were pretty solidly above average, even if they were abysmal, on the floor. And there was different degrees of this happening in some of the different tests. I can't quite remember which was which. I think I want to say the grammar test was like the flattest line where everybody was guessing pretty high, but that could have been the logic test. I think the humor test was more skewed, where like the low performers had a lower score, but it's still very lopsided. If you're a low performer, you're guessing that you're at least above average. That's basically the results that they got.
Yeah. And let's try to focus on the humor test.
Did you read how they did it?
Yes, and it's kind of confusing, but and when I started reading it, I was like, a test on humor?
I know.
How are you gonna do that? And it was interesting. But yeah, explain how they did that.
Well, so they gave these people a written test. I mean, they sat down in a quiet room, or like, here's a bunch of jokes typed out on, a Scantron or something. And they had to rank them in order of funniness. And the authors even put some of the jokes in the paper, which was pretty good. Should we read those? Read the unfunny one. That was pretty unfunny.
It might take me a second to find it.
Okay, well, all right, I'll finish describing it. So they put these, they told everyone to rank these jokes in order of funniness. And then and before they administered the test, they contacted some experts, that's what they said, professional comedians, and they asked the experts to rate the funniness of the jokes. And what was great was that they got like a pretty good consensus. Most of these experts rated them pretty consistently, but there was one guy who rated them like really out of whack, so they just threw his out. They're like, that guy's not funny, let's just forget about him.
But the other ones were so close in their answers.
Yeah, there was like broad consensus except for one guy, which is funny.
Okay, this was the non-funny joke. So if you laugh at this, then you failed the test.
Objectively, you're bad.
What is big as a man but weighs nothing? Answer is shadow. So that's not funny.
I do agree. It's kind of clever, I guess, but it's not funny. Read the funny one. This one just killed.
All right. If you don't laugh at this one, then you're also very wrong. If a kid asks where rain comes from, I think a cute thing to tell him is, God is crying. And if he asks why God is crying, another cute thing to tell him is probably because of something you did.
I thought that was kind of funny.
Okay,
Mostly because being cruel to children is funny. We can all agree upon that.
Well, anyway, that was one of their funnier ones. But I don't want to get too caught up in the details. Read the paper yourself.
I like the jokes. Anyway, so yes, this was one of the tests they administered. And I guess if you're going to test people on funniness, then, I can't think of a better way. But the takeaway was, if we'll just take it at face value, if your sense of humor sucks and you think the shadow joke was hilarious, you probably, at least according to their results, think that your sense of humor is pretty good. And the same thing applied for the logic test. The people who performed really poorly on the logic test, they didn't realize that pretty much across the board. Or even if they thought that they performed poorly, they never assumed that they were in the bottom of the group. They always guessed that they were relatively high, at least above average. That was pretty much like the takeaway. And then same for the grammar test. If your grammar's bad, you might think that it's not that great, but you're still going to guess that you're like at least above average grammar-wise.
Right. So, well, these are like very isolated little skills. How do you think it applies in different areas?
Well, so the authors talk about this a little bit, and I think this is where it kind of gets more interesting and more subtle, and why the Dunning Kruger effect can't just be a meme. They talked about like the effect showed up to different degrees in different domains, and I'm sorry I forget which is which, but I think it was the humor test that people, had the best read on their relative ability. But I have never I don't know, golfed before. I've done, what's it called? The really expensive one.
Putt golf? Oh, Top Golf?
Top golf, yeah.
Okay.
That's about it for me. And I don't think that I'm very good at golf. If you said, hey, if you had to go compete, go out there and golf, how good do you think it'd be? I'd be like, well, I don't know. What's like the lowest you can be in golf? Bad. I don't have any illusion of competence in the golf. Or at least I don't think I do. But, and that they specifically call it out. Like nobody thinks they can just beat Michael Jordan in a basketball game.
Right.
But in an area where you do have some basic understanding, like you are roughly familiar with grammar because we all speak English and we've gone to school and like we have some familiarity with it. If you're in an area like that, you almost always assume that you're roughly above average in terms of performance. And that goes for if you are above average in performance, and it also goes for if you aren't. Like pretty much by definition, half of us are underperforming, and no one thinks that. Everyone assumes they're up there.
I almost think it's like if you don't have the information in order to know that for sure, your brain will automatically choose the most favorable option for you to protect yourself. And so if you don't know that much, you don't know enough to be able to tell that you're bad, your brain's going to tell you that you're actually pretty good at it because that's what feels the best.
And I think that's a big assertion that the authors were making, is that if you're very good, you actually do have a pretty good bead on where you're at. You underestimate yourself by a little, but that's probably just a mathematical artifact. And we can talk about the scale end effects or regression effects later. But for the, like, basically, if you're really good, you probably know it. But if you aren't, and you're guessing, you're probably going to guess that you're pretty good. Like you said, you seem to fall back to, I don't really know, I think I'm probably pretty good. That seems to be a pretty universal effect.
Okay, so let's all assume that if you're not that great at something, you'll think that you're okay or pretty good at it.
Yeah.
Why is that so incredibly dangerous?
Well,
or why does this matter? Right? Like other than being just a fun little thing or a fun little observation, like why does this matter?
here's a little example that kind of stuck out to me from the past year. You're familiar with Elon Musk, yeah?
Yeah.
Very smart guy in certain domains, right? If you, and you can watch this if you go watch an interview with him, if you ask him a question about rocketry and that sort of thing, he will answer it. He will answer it at a level that you probably will have a hard time understanding. He seems to not really have much of a limit in those areas in terms of like his understanding. He knows what the company's doing. He is able to talk in great detail about the designs they've tried and so on. Smart guy in that sense. In 2020, in March, he made a tweet, and he said, as close as I can remember, based on current cases, COVID, in the US, COVID should be at near 0 cases by the end of April. And he was unbelievably wrong. Like, you could hardly get more wrong. 90% of the pandemic that we are all familiar with now happened, from that point on. Super wrong. Now, probably Twitter shouldn't exist, and I don't think anybody should be taken too hard to task because Twitter sucks and we just shouldn't have that. That's my little opinion. But clearly, this guy who's very, very smart, really, really understands some very fundamental, deep principles in certain areas, was talking about a field that he clearly didn't understand at all. And I think that epidemiology is one of those domains that we all kind of feel like we can think about. Like, it's a virus. We know about viruses. We get them sometimes. We can, it's going down. It'll probably be gone soon. Or, it's going up. It's going to eat the world and whatever. Like, we just have that illusion of competence there. And I think there's another somewhat related cognitive bias here, in that it's like the domain transfer illusion. Elon Musk is very smart in a certain area, and he likely thinks that he's just smart across the board. And I don't think that's a safe thing to ever think. If you're really good at one thing, you're good at that thing. And you might even not be. You might be suffering from the Dunning Kruger Effect, where you are overestimating your ability even in that domain. You need objective information to even be able to say that. But if you're crossing domains, you are especially likely to grossly overestimate how good you are at something. And it's dangerous. I mean, in the pandemic sense, it's dangerous because people's behavior matters during a pandemic, obviously. And so you don't want to influence behavior in the wrong direction. But also, and this is something that authors talk about quite a bit, if you're a low performer, they call it like a double burden. Basically, you suck, and you don't really know you suck, and you are going to have a hard time getting better, because a lot of the skills that you need to be good at something are the skills you need to do self-assessment and like understand where you're flawed. It's like double hard to improve because you're bad, and that is already rough, but then like you can't really, it's hard for you to evaluate how you're bad and how to be not bad.
I think that was what is really interesting and terrifying. It's like, that feeling where you feel like you are totally right, like you are 100% absolutely correct in this belief. There's one of two reasons why you can feel that way. Number one reason is that you actually are correct, and you know that you're correct. And reason number two is that you are wrong, and you lack the ability to be able to tell that you're wrong. And both of them give the exact same feeling. They have the same result. And that's a really scary thing, because anyone can believe anything wholeheartedly, and it's either because they're right or because they lack the ability to see that they're wrong.
Right.
Uh-oh.
That was the cat opening the door, not a ghost.
Mike's door just opened, and I thought maybe it was going to be that guy with the gun from a few episodes ago.
I thought that too, but there was no one there. It was just an empty doorway, and then a cat. And of course, she immediately starts screaming to go out. Good Lord. What were you saying?
I'm saying that when was the last time you heard an argument between two people that one person actually convinced the other person that they were wrong? And when was the last time you heard two people arguing about religion where one of them changed their mind? Like,
never mind, like, not even religion. It doesn't even have to be that deep.
well, I'm using it as an example of something you like believe really strongly.
I've been on a health kick, like doing some research on, I don't know, trying to improve my diet and whatnot. And oh my God, I like waded into the diet religious wars. And there's, the paleo people who are 100% sure that paleo is the way to eat. And they are right. That's the true form of eating. And then there's the vegan people. And then there's the keto. And then there's the Mediterranean diet. And there's everything you can think of. And they're all like, no, you think you're right, but I know I'm right. Like, I think I'm right, but I'm like, I'm really right. Like,
Right.
you
I'm
just
really
think it, but I'm really, really right. And they're all thinking the same thing.
It's either that they're right or that they
Right.
lack the ability to see that they're wrong. And yeah, it's amazing. So every strong-held belief that you have or that I have, you should be a little skeptical of.
I would say
Because
not even a little. Like, you should be majorly skeptical. Like, you might think you're really smart or you're really good at something because you are, or because you're not, and you don't know the difference.
think about every time you think back to like when you were a young teenager, like a preteen or something, every time you look back and you're embarrassed, that's because you thought you were right in the past.
Yeah.
And that's only because you lacked the knowledge that you have now. And that was the Dunning Kruger effect.
And picture yourself in 10 years looking back at how stupid you are now,
Right.
and so on. I
Right.
guess eventually we die, so can't go on forever, but
Right. But it's really interesting because when I initially looked this up, I was thinking like, the simple stuff, dumb people don't know that they're dumb or whatever. Or maybe it applies to like, a skill. Like when you first start out, you think you're actually a little bit better than you are, whatever. But it actually is so intertwined with everything. Like this is a thing that happens all throughout your experience in a skill or your experience through life. Like we will just assume that we're right when actually we don't have all of the knowledge because we don't know that knowledge exists.
right. Yeah, that's that was the big takeaway from me, or for me, is that you do not have the ability to know how good you are compared to your peers. Like, that's not a judgment that you are able to make. And it makes sense that you can't, because of course you can't. If you're judging against this group of peers, you don't know how good they are. Like, all these students walked in and they took a test, and they're asked to guess not just how good did you do, but how good are all the other people around you. They don't know.
Right.
How good of a sense of humor does this random person from their class have? They don't know. So they're just guessing. And they all guessed in roughly the same range, from like 60 to 80%. Like, oh, I'm probably up there, because that's just our fantasy of ourselves pretty much across the board. And that's what bothers me so much about kind of the popular take of the stupid people are stupid. That take is basically saying, I know who the stupid people are. It's those people. It's not me. I'm not suffering from the Dunning Kruger effect. It's an effect for stupid people. And the whole point is that you do not know that. And the only thing you can really rely on is some form of objective measurement. If they reveal the test scores after the test, then you can go, oh, I did pretty well. Or, holy crap, I'm not funny at all. I thought the shadow joke was hilarious. There's something wrong with me. And you need to reevaluate your sense of humor. Or go find that comedian who agreed with you that they threw out the results from. Like, if you, in the absence of an objective measurement, you really don't have anything. You can't evaluate yourself according to your peers. That was like the big life lesson that I got from this research.
Well, they also did they brought them back in, and you'll have to make sure I say this right, but they brought them back in to grade 5 of the tests of the other students, and then after reviewing those tests, they had to reevaluate the score that they thought they had, right?
Yeah, so I think what essentially what happened was they had the high performers come back in, and they basically reviewed other people's tests, and they got a better picture of what the other scores were like. And the top performers had underestimated themselves a bit. If you were the very top of the group, you were probably still guessing that you're like 80% or something like that, right? So they called this I think it's the false consensus bias. Basically, if you aced a test, there's a pretty good chance that you walk away thinking, oh, I bet everybody aced the test. It was like a really easy test, right? You just tend to think that other people think the way you do. And I think it's probably similar to what's going on at the bottom. You're like, I don't think I did that well, but probably no one else did well. That was a really hard test. Like, you just kind of project your own experience on everyone else. But so if the top performers, when they were exposed to other scores, they go, oh, this person was really bad. They got all this wrong. I think I actually did better than I initially evaluated. Like, it kind of reveals the false consensus bias a little bit. Whereas for the low performers, they didn't know what the hell they were doing in the first place. So seeing other people's tests, they're like, they must have got it wrong. That's not what I got. Like they weren't really able to evaluate things much better after seeing other tests because they failed the test. Like, you can't take much out of someone else's performance if you don't even understand it.
Well, that's the part that I thought was really interesting, is that
Yeah.
the low performers didn't learn anything because they lack the knowledge and ability to recognize that they don't know anything, and they don't know what knowledge there is to gain. So they did no better after seeing the other students work. Whereas the people with some knowledge in that area, they actually improved even more. And we've kind of talked about this stuff before, where if you have like no model to continue building, like no mental idea of this thing to build on, like all of that stuff just goes away, and you never build up anything. You never continue learning in that area. So things that you're not good at or things you don't understand, you will continue to not understand them until you get like a foothold in that area.
So here's a question. This is getting outside of what was actually studied, but in this group of, and this wasn't like the general population. This was literally volunteer Cornell undergrads, all from one class, who needed extra credit. Like, that's, so we probably shouldn't extrapolate this too broadly because it's really a very narrow subset. But in these groups that they studied, clearly these groups of people, the low performers were not able to evaluate themselves very well. Do you think that you could? Are there signs you could look for that maybe these people didn't, but can you know when you're a low performer? Can you say, like, is there something to recognize there? Because there was a difference. Like we said, after reviewing tests, the low performers didn't really change anything, but the high performers did. Like, is there a sign there or something you can kind of latch onto, do you think?
Well, according to the paper, or this line of thinking, is that the knowledge you need in order to know where you stand, you don't have.
Well, right. But in this example, the high performers saw other people's tests and that caused them to reevaluate. They're like, oh, you know what? I actually did better than I thought. Like, the act of them reviewing other people's work gave them new information. Whereas the low performers, they reviewed other people's work and it didn't. They're like, nah, I think I was right. Spot on to begin with. Like, it didn't give them anything new. And I feel like there is something there. Again, this is well outside the actual paper itself, right? But okay, here's a slightly more concrete example. I play Starcraft, right? If you've listened to any of his podcasts, you've heard me talk about that. And I know where I stand in Starcraft because I'm ranked. There's a number associated with my skill level, so I can objectively say I am up in the top like 1 to 2% of the player base. So I know where I'm at there. And when I play a Starcraft game, usually, let's say I lose and I get done and I'm like, oh my God, I suck at this game. Why did I mess this up again? Why did I do that? Why did I make that wrong decision? Like, I have this very strong feeling of these are all the things I messed up. a while ago, started thinking, I think I'm going to pick up chess a little bit. Just play chess on my phone, chess.com, that kind of stuff. And here's an example of the Dunning Kruger effect for different domains. I was thinking, I bet I'll be all right at chess, right? Like, I mean, I'm really good at Starcraft, or at least relatively pretty good at Starcraft. And they're like a little bit similar, they're kind of strategy games. They're a little bit, speed based, especially if you're playing like fast chess, bullet or something. So I'm like, I bet I'll be above average. Nope. Terrible. Absolute garbage at chess. And I know that because you're given a rating in chess, and my rating was garbage. So for one, that is, I think, an example of the Dunning Kruger effect kind of smacking me in the face of, oh, the fact that you're good at this game does not mean you're good at this game. You suck. But the other thing was that I played it for a while and I dropped it because I started to get really frustrated because I would play the game against someone else who also sucked. And it just felt like I would play the game through and I'd be like, I think the moves are pretty good. I'm not making any like big mistakes or anything. I'm keeping my pieces and, whatever. And then maybe I'd make a mistake and blunder the queen and lose or whatever. And I'm like, oh, I made a mistake. But like for the most part, it just feels like my plays, it's pretty good, not making any dumb mistakes. And it just felt like nothing was happening. I would play a game and just not really get anywhere. And it wasn't until later when I kind of said, I want to figure this out. What is wrong with me? Why can I not progress at chess? That I started reading a little bit more on like tactics and, getting like taking some external resources and just learning more about the game beyond the basic rules and whatnot, and going, oh, there's like real objectives that you're trying to do here. There's ways of baiting your opponent into things. Like there's actual moves to be made that I just wasn't seeing before. And it started to get into this state where I'm thinking, oh, I suck at this game, but I can kind of see why. Like I missed this very obvious, really good move. That's why I suck. Because I didn't see that, or I'm not looking for that. And and I'm sure that's only a tiny little fraction of what a really good chess player experiences, but like it started to reveal itself to me. And to me, that feels like a little bit of a signal that kind of corresponds to that particular test that they did, where if nothing is sticking, where you're getting information and like none of it feels like it matters, that might be a sign that you're bad.
Yes. And it seems like the only safe route to go is to learn more.
Yes,
Right?
and actually that was something they talked about.
Yeah. It's like they kept talking about metacognition, like the incompetent groups or the lower performing groups lacked the metacognition in order to be able to tell that they were wrong. And they kept talking about it as if it was like a byproduct of them being bad, but I keep thinking that it might be reversed, and that the fact that they lack their metacognition might be the reason why they're not so good at it. Or at least that they're linked in that way. So the way to kind of build that is to learn more and understand things better and pay attention to how you think and question. I think that might be what metacognition is the constant second guessing. Well, that's also what anxiety is, but it's like the constant second guessing of these beliefs or pieces of knowledge that you think you have, and making sure that they're right, not being satisfied with just things that you've believed in the past.
Oh, okay. So having gone through all that, what do you think the big takeaways are here? Like what do you need to do? What should you take from this piece of research?
You could be falling victim to the Dunning Kruger effect in areas that you don't even know. Like they could areas that you think you have down and you think you're doing really well in could be the areas that are holding you back because you just simply don't know. And you wouldn't think to question them because you already fully believe that you're right. Right? So, well, my big takeaway would be to question that.
I see it like Schrodinger's cat, right? Like the cat is both dead and alive at the same time and you can't know or whatever. We could talk about that in a different podcast if that's not clear to anyone. But if you don't have objective measurements, then you can't know where you're at. You might think you're good, and maybe you're good, maybe you're not. Everyone thinks that. That's the big thing there. Everyone thinks they're pretty good. So you need objective measurements, and if you don't have them, then you should not trust that feeling at all. And you should figure that there's a very real possibility that you're nowhere near as good as you think you are. And then I think the second piece there, this is again me speculating, but I think if you were to focus a bit, maybe don't worry so much about where you stand with other people. This is one of the things they covered, was that the thing that improved people's ability to assess themselves was just plain getting better. So eyes on your own work, try to improve at the thing. And I do think that there are some signals that you might be able to take, like the fact that you aren't progressing and new information isn't updating your understanding. That, I think, is a red flag that you might not be doing so well.
And I wouldn't limit it to just thinking you're good or not thinking you're good, because that's not really what it is. It's kind of believing that you're right or believing that you're wrong.
Yeah, like being extremely confident that you're right is objectively the wrong thing to do.
Right.
Right? Because
yeah,
everyone thinks that.
I mean, I think so. I don't know.
Yeah, well said. All right. Don't assume that everyone's stupid but you. That's not what the Dunning Kruger Effect is about. The Dunning Kruger Effect is about how you might be one of the stupid ones. And we all are, in some area at least. At minimum, there's areas that we don't know much about. So let's be a little more humble. In fact, I think the author, after the paper got popular, said something to that exact effect, that the paper is about, it's about us. It's about being humble. So let's try to do that. Thanks guys for listening. Sorry it took so long to get around to that suggestion, but we're looking for new topics, so send in anything that you think would be interesting to get into. Leave us a comment, hang out with us on Discord. You can email us at the overanalyzerspodcast@gmail.com. We'll see you next week.